Hey, welcome everybody to the May 2024 episode of the FR Panorama series. This is the eighth in our ongoing bi-monthly webinar series, and we welcome you here. I'm Larry Liberti, and together with my co-host, Dr. Mario Alanis, we'll be your host for today's webinar. And as we go ahead and we look into this very interesting concept of sameness is today's topic. So since the start of this program in January 2023, an average of 300 participants have signed up from around the world and registered for these very informative webinars. As in the past with other webinars, today's registrants represent a global mix of people from the pharmaceutical industry, from regulatory agencies, universities, NGOs, and patients and trade associations. So a real blend of participants. And actually, you represent colleagues from countries all across Asia, Europe, North America, Latin America, and Africa. So welcome, everyone. You know, this webinar series was created to help stakeholders gain a practical understanding around how to implement and refine, or actually just consider the use of what we call facilitated regulatory pathways, including reliance pathways. So FR Panorama is an educational program. It's a program of the RUD Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which is the sponsor of the FR Path project also. And in particular, we're most grateful for the ongoing support provided by MSD for the FR Panorama project. So the input and guidance from our advisory committee, topic experts, and past participants continually help us to shape the content of the webinar series. And as a reminder, all of the prior webinars are archived on the frpath.org website. So if you have a little bit of time and want to go back and check those out, feel free to do so. It's our real sincere hope that by participating in these webinars, you'll get practical insights into addressing your questions about what do we mean when we talk about product sameness. This is a very important topic that's on everybody's mind. And this is particularly important when we talk about sameness in relationship to making reliance decisions. So as attention is being paid to sameness of products being assessed by agencies, the question arises also as to how to best determine the risk of a difference in a product to the patient. So the regulators has to balance the differences with the risk, and the sponsor should be able to clearly elucidate the implications of potential differences in sameness. So in this session, we're going to delve into how to recognize and how to categorize risks when sameness differences are identified. Today, we'll be addressing topics such as what does sameness mean and what needs to be controlled for when we think about sameness. But before we explore our topics for today, I'd like to introduce my co-host and colleague, Dr. Mario Alanis. Mario?
Yes, hello, Larry. Thank you. It's always a great pleasure to be in these webinars. As usual, today we have a fascinating group of colleagues who will share with us their knowledge and experience on this very interesting topic of sameness. I believe that it is key for the advancement of reliance that we advance in having a common understanding of exactly what we mean by sameness and to discuss issues related to this topic. For example, are the conditions for sameness equal for innovative NMEs, bioproducts, or generics? Is it possible to comply with sameness even if a manufacturing site is different? How can regulators and sponsors agree on a definition of sameness that would facilitate reliance? I am sure each speaker will discuss very relevant issues related to sameness. So, Larry, let's get started.
Thanks, Mario. Yeah. So as in the past, today's session will last 1 hour and 15 minutes. We hope that you'll find this to be an excellent use of your time. So please feel free to suggest questions in the chat box. You'll see a chat box that we will be monitoring. We'll do our best to monitor this. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity to pose your questions to our guests. Interestingly, we're also going to be doing a survey, and we'll have some questions for you to address as we move along. So today we're going to dive into the topic of product sameness and risk assessment. And as agencies and companies look to simplify and facilitate reliance, we thought it would be helpful to provide insights with practical examples of what does sameness mean or what needs to be controlled for sameness. So let's get started and hear from our three speakers who will each give us a different point of view when it comes to the concept of sameness. First, Dr. Charles Preston, the Senior Program Officer in Regulatory Affairs at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, will talk about what does sameness mean in the context of global medicine availability. He'll be followed by Dr. Aisha Motsani, the Senior Principal Assistant Director at the Center for Product and Cosmetic Evaluation at the NPRA agency in Malaysia. And she'll be talking about a practical approach to sameness and how the NPRA has used sameness. And then our third speaker is Dr. Celine Bourguignon, the head of Greater China and Intercontinental and Emerging Market Regulatory Policy and Intelligence at GSK, who will be speaking on behalf of IFPMA about how can we convey differences in sameness in the context of risk assessment. How do we convey sameness? So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Mario to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Larry. It is an honor for me to introduce my longtime friend and distinguished professional colleague, Charlie Preston. Charlie is a public health physician with a long and meaningful experience in regulatory systems strengthening and access to quality medicines in low and middle income countries. His career spans from the US FDA, the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, and now with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Charlie, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to be with you, Mario, and also with you, Larry, and to be able to present in such a important forum. So I am going to ask that we could call up the first slide, please. Perfect. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sameness in the context of global medicine availability. And next slide, please. I guess I can control that. And I just wanted to take a step back and talk about another phenomenon that I think drives this sameness issue, and just speak a little bit to my experience around this. And so this first slide is really asking kind of like, what do we know about this issue? And one thing that I wanted to say is that tiered manufacturing is really kind of like the driver of sameness. And what do we mean by tiered manufacturing? This is where a company would have one version of a product, same molecule, dose, and formulation, that would go to one market, a highly regulated market, and they would have a different version that would go to a less regulated market. And that's a driver for sameness. And so it's an interesting phenomenon. And when you look in the peer-reviewed literature to try to get a better understanding of this practice, there are very few articles that are actually published about it. It's not something that maybe is the most spoken about practice. I think there are sensitivities to it. It's also something that's maybe more of a kind of business strategy practice that maybe doesn't always make its way into the peer-reviewed literature. So difficult sometimes to be able to wrap arms around everything that's implied here. But we'll talk a little bit about some of what I've observed in terms of this practice and how it plays out in the field in the next slides. But let me just say a couple of other things here. So there is some discussion of tiered manufacturing in the popular press. and that's important to recognize. And we're aware of some data that is pretty interesting in the context of tiered manufacturing. That is that it costs more to make a product for a highly regulated market than it does for a less regulated market. And if you understand the economics of it, then it's maybe not surprising that there is this kind of phenomenon of tiered manufacturing, and that what you tend to see happen is low income countries get a different version than the highly regulated markets in high income countries. So this is obviously an important factor to consider in reliance. And as Larry and Mario were already speaking to, if you've got a reliance system that's based on a reference authority, you want to make sure that whatever the reference authority has approved is the same product that's being submitted to the agency. And so we'll talk more about some of those pieces. So this is what I was mentioning. This is just to give you a little bit more of a feel for kind of how the tiered manufacturing piece and sameness has played out in some of the different experiences that I've had over the last couple of years. And just kind of as a broad context, one of the things that we tend to see is that national procurers, the folks who are purchasing medicines on behalf of the government in low income, middle income country settings, tend to focus on, at least what I've seen, they tend to focus on the lowest priced products. And that can be a problem in terms of driving out quality assured products. And by quality assured, we tend to mean SRA or PQ, and SRA will soon be WLA. But it tends to drive out the higher cost, quality costs, the higher cost products in the market, because if folks are just going to purchase the cheapest product, then what incentive does the manufacturer have to sell a higher cost, higher quality version? And in fact, we're aware of some information that in Africa, in one particular example where we have some data, there was a country where there was a subsidy to purchase a PQ SRA version, a quality assured version, uh, uh, quality assured versions of products on the market. And when the subsidy ended, the prevalence of those products, the SRA PQ versions, went down. And it, the market, the products that came in and replaced those quality assured versions were the lower cost but not quality assured version. So that was another interesting kind of like data point around this. And then just to speak, I spent a number of years in the Caribbean. We were standing up a regional regulatory system there that was based on reliance. And we saw some interesting phenomena there around this kind of phenomenon of tiered manufacturing. And one of them was that in the reliance system that we had set up, we said that you could basically have a number of different reference authorities as your reference authority. And but what we tended to see was we did not see applications from PQ or SRA type reference authorities. It was other reference authorities that where you would get dossiers submitted to this mechanism that we had set up in the Caribbean. So that was another interesting kind of just data point in this journey. And then just one other piece that I thought is kind of interesting. It speaks maybe to a little bit of a different phenomenon, but we also were aware of information where a regional procurer in the Caribbean was purchasing products from a major North American company where the products were not approved in the country where the manufacturer was based. So they were selling products to the Caribbean that did not have marketing authorization in the home country of the manufacturer, which was another interesting. We call that export only manufacturing, but it has a lot of the same elements as the tiered manufacturing, kind of a different version for a different market depending on the regulatory situation in that market. So this is a slide that's really designed to just speak to some information that we're aware of about the manufacturing differences that go into a kind of a tiered manufacturing situation. And that can be in terms of facility and operations, it can be less expensive equipment that are being used in the manufacture of products for a low regulatory environment. It could be less preventive maintenance and calibration, less automation and real time data acquisition, less warehousing, less cleaning requirements, less and lower paid folks working in the facilities, and there can also be quality assurance and regulatory. This is just giving a flavor. There may be others, but less documentation and traceability, less inspections. And so when we see that kind of information, it does beg the question for us is, are there quality implications to this phenomenon of tiered manufacturing? I think that's where the sameness piece comes in, is if there are potentially quality implications, and this slide kind of lays out what some of those may be. I mean, for example, you could have bioequivalence differences. um, you could have impurities, you could have cross contamination, you could have higher microbiological contamination. So there's a variety of things, and if there are quality implications to this, then it makes it even more important to make sure that on the sameness front, you're getting the same product in your reliance pathway that the reference authority approved. So the next slide is really just kind of, this is the kind of advice that we give to countries. And that is basically that in a reliance scenario, thinking about sameness, WHO has put out some guidance around this. And in their collaborative registration procedure, they talk about the elements that are needed to kind of satisfy sameness. And these are the things that folks should look for, the regulator should look for as they're doing a kind of sameness assessment. So, WHO has already put this information out there, and this is just kind of one place that they've done it. There may be some others, but it's things like having the same qualitative and quantitative formulation. It's things like having the same manufacturing site. And we believe in this one very strongly because it's important to make sure that each of the manufacturing sites that are involved in the application have in some way been approved by the reference authority. And it doesn't, in terms of our understanding, and also in terms of WHO's, having other manufacturing sites that have never been looked at would constitute a major difference that would not make a product the same. So the manufacturing site is a really important one. The same specifications for the excipient, and you can read the other kinds of pieces to this. And I put the site to the WHO guidance from the collaborative registration procedure at the end of this slide. So please feel free to follow up on that. And then in terms of kind of like how to operationalize that particular set of recommendations from WHO, yes, that's what you should do in the collaborative registration procedure. But outside of that, when I was in the Caribbean, we had developed a kind of verification procedure that was an interesting way of operationalizing all of this. And so this example is from the Caribbean regulatory system. It's the reliance mechanism that we had set up, and we were in an interesting situation because we did not have any kind of confidentiality agreements with the reference authorities. And my guess is that that's probably the place that most low income regulatory situations have. They're not going to have confidentiality agreements to kind of with the reference authority to be able to verify and check the information. So we had to rely on publicly available information. and that can pose some challenges. But one of the things that we did was we asked for a cover letter from the manufacturer in great detail that went through and said, this is the same product in this regard, in this regard, in this regard. And it gave us at least a kind of legal document that the manufacturer was signing off on to say that this was the same product. So that was one important tool. And the other thing is that we would try to cross check as much as we could with what information was available on the reference authority's website. Sometimes in the market authorization certificate, you would have information like even the address of the manufacturing plant. So that was very helpful. I will say that publishing information like manufacturing site address is a super helpful tool to be able to do reliance. And there are some leading regulatory authorities that do not publish that information well. I'm thinking of one example where they publish only the zip code and nothing more in terms of the address. So it's very difficult to get the address and the unit and all of that information that WHO recommends if you only have an address on the public facing website. So there's a lot of work that I think could be done to kind of improve what the reference authorities are doing in terms of sharing that information. And so I think that sort of wraps up my presentation. I think in summary, I would just say definitely need awareness among regulators. And I would also say national procurers that tiered manufacturing is happening. And thus, in reliance, you need implementation of strong verification procedures to ensure sameness. And it's not only at the registration phase, it's also after the product is on the market, doing checks to make sure that you're still getting the same kind of reference authority approved version. Because again, the economics of it dictate that the company might have an incentive to send a different tiered version. So I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Charlie. That was really an interesting practical presentation. It's so important for us to think globally about these implications. And something I hadn't really thought a lot about were the economic drivers of sameness. So thanks very much for highlighting that. We did have one question, perhaps just for a quick clarification, and it has to do with some of the examples that you've identified. And I'll just sort of paraphrase the question with regard to when you see these kinds of differences in tiered production, are these the same product from the same manufacturer that are being produced maybe on different lines, or is it let's say the same product, and is it from manufacturer A does it one way and manufacturer B does it a different way? What kind of experiences have you run into?
I mean, our sense at the time was that this is the same manufacturer with the same molecule dose and formulation that's sending different versions of a product to different markets. So for the high regulatory market, so for example, let's take a company that's got a PQ'd product. They're sending their PQ'd product to I don't know, pick Europe or something like that, but they're not sending their PQ'd version to Africa. And so we would see those, and in that case, it was the Caribbean. I mean, we got very few applications of PQ'd products, even though we knew the manufacturers had PQ'd
Hmm.
versions of those products, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, that's illuminating for me for sure, and maybe I think for our participants also. So I think that's very very interesting. So let's see. So here we are. Now we're honored to have with us Dr. Nur Aisha Modsani of the Malaysian NPRA. And we've asked Aisha to join us today because her agency, the Malaysian NPRA, has been at the forefront of practically applying the concept of sameness within how their regulatory decision making occurs. So, how does the Malaysian agency address sameness as part of this decision making? And with that, Aisha, will turn it over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Greeting from Kuala Lumpur. First and foremost, I would like to thank Dr. Larry and Dr. Mario for inviting me to speak in this webinar. So, as we may aware that many agencies, regulatory agencies, are interested in implementing reliance and risk-based approach. But how the reliance model can be practically implemented more effectively in order to speed up the approval of medicine in the country. So for information, NPRA or National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency in Malaysia have implemented reliance since the introduction of facilitated registration pathway, or in short FRP guideline, in 2019. So today I would like to share our experience in implementing reliance in marketing authorization assessment, specifically to talk more about the practical approach to sameness and risk-based approach. So within 15 minutes, I will try to briefly just start with introduction about MPRA, and then followed by tools in facilitating reliance and risk-based approach, which focus on the FRP guideline, what is the scope, the eligibility criteria, the requirement, etc. Before we move into the practical consideration to verify the sameness and the use of risk-based approach in the assessment, focusing on the differences and a locally critical. So last, I will summarize my overall presentation. So just an introduction about NPRA, an agency that I work with. So NPRA, or National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency, is a national medicine regulatory agency in Malaysia under the Ministry of Health, which are responsible in registering pharmaceutical products, traditionals, health supplement, and notification of cosmetic products that are marketed in Malaysia. So in order to achieve timely patient access to medicine, NPRA already moving towards a greater emphasis on reliance and risk-based evaluation, focusing on what is locally critical and what we can leverage or rely upon from the decision made by the stringent authority through a reliance model with the introduction of the FRP guideline. So as you may aware, reliance is a useful tool to improve the efficiency, especially improving the application approval timeline, to provide early access to medical product for patient, most importantly, the unmet medical need product accessible in timely manner, reducing the regulatory burden as well as to reduce duplication of work, especially for product that has been approved by the stringent authority. So now let's talk about the tools, regulatory tools in facilitating the reliance and risk-based approach, which is the FRP guideline. But before that, I just would like to share that, as you know, several considerations need to be done before reliance can really be embedded in the national regulatory strategy, such as having an adequate investment of resources and time, and also cultural change. So I just would like to share step-by-step preparation of the FRP framework in Malaysia. So in early 2018, there was a political will where we received a direction by the top management to mandate the introduction of this new Reliant pathway, whereby the benefit of Reliant were clearly explained to all the relevant staff, which is very critical to drive towards the culture change. So the next step involved the investment of resources and time. We established a task force, a dedicated task force, to prepare the draft of the guideline. And once the guideline is prepared, we circulated to the stakeholder, and we had further engagement with them, providing feedback to question and clarification. And from that, based on the outcome of the stakeholder engagement, we finalized and endorsed the FRP guideline in 2019. So this FRP guideline act as a key enablers for the implementation of Reliant. But for a start, at that time, we only limited to two reference agencies, which are EMA and US FDA, and only the product's scope is only limited to biologic and new chemical entity. So based on the prior implementation from 2019 until 2023, we further revised the guideline to include more features, expand the scope of product, and also we add more reference agencies, as well as tools that may facilitate the reliance and risk-based approach. So from the revised guideline, we expanded the scope of the products to include generic medicine and cell and gene therapy products, apart from new chemical entity and biologics. We also added 5 more reference agencies as on the slide, as bold on the slide. And also we added ASEAN joint assessment. And we also revised the timeline for abbreviated review and also verification review. So before we talk in more detail about verification of the sameness, let's see what is the eligibility criteria, requirement, and tools included in the FRP guideline. So for the eligibility criteria, the product submitted must be submitted to NPRA within 3 years from the date of approval by the chosen reference agency or the procedure. And we also mentioned in the guideline that the manufacturing site must be inspected by NEPICS members, and the quality part focusing on the including formulation, process, control, specification, etc., and drug master file, and also the proposed package insert and package information leaflet should be identical, should be the same as what has been approved by the reference agencies. But apart from that, there are certain things that we may consider differences as what has been approved by the reference agencies if it is clearly justified. For example, differences in container closure system, pack size, or storage condition to meet the ASEAN stability requirement. And we also may consider a difference in manufacturing site of the drug product if it's very clearly justified or very strongly justified, and also a difference in the brand name. So what are the product that is not eligible to be under the FRP? Product that has been approved under the exceptional circumstances. For example, in EMA, the product has been registered under the conditional marketing authorization, where the product is only supported by early phase clinical data like phase 2, while phase 3 is still ongoing, or approved via reliant pathway in the reference country. So those product is not eligible to be submitted under FRP in Malaysia. So what are the documents required under the reliant pathway or under the FRP guideline? So the full dossier, a full technical dossier will always be required, but in terms of assessment, only parts will be assessed during the review. So the important regulatory tools for reliance are, of course, the assessment report from the chosen reference agencies. That will also include other documents like question and answer document, and also document pertaining to the post-approval changes or variation. And at the same time, the applicant also need to submit a proof of approval and also declaration letter and declaration statement to declare that all aspect of the product quality, etc., must be identical to the currently approved by the reference agencies, and also to declare that information and documents submitted to NPRA are true and authentic. So other tools that were included in the guideline are also dossier checklist. This is a very important tool for the applicant to highlight if there are any differences between the dossier submitted to NPRA and what has been approved by the reference agencies. If there are any difference, they need to highlight and provide justification. And with the dossier checklist, this will ease our assessor to focus where to verify the sameness and where to do thorough assessment, especially when there are differences. So we also have a flow chart in the guideline to provide a clearer picture to the applicant of the whole processes involved under the FRP. So other tools to facilitate reliance, we also prepare internal standard operating procedure for the assessor, and also we prepared a FAQ to provide to give clarity in certain issues raised by the applicant, and these will be uploaded to the NPRA website. So next, let's talk about what are the key practices that may facilitate reliance, which is a verification of the sameness. So verification of the sameness underpin this practice, which we need to verify that the product submitted to the relying NRA, which is NPRA, in all important aspects are identical or same to the product that was authorized or approved by the reference agency. So from the assessor point of view, based on the dossier checklist that I have shown in the previous slide, prepared by the applicant, so NPRA assessor will take note on the differences, if any, and then will focus to verify the sameness. So we consider information in the assessment report by the reference agencies and also post-approval changes document, and then we will cross-check with the dossier as necessary. So basically, the assessor will leverage in many parts of the reference agency information as in the assessment report, especially for quality, except the differences such as stability data to meet ASEAN requirement. And we also have a full reliance to the non-clinical data without the need to re-evaluate the information or the data. As for the clinical study, the extent in relying or leveraging the data is product specific. Depending on the category of product, either it's innovator, biosimilar, or generic with different approach. For example, for innovator, we may rely on phase 1 and phase 2, but giving more attention on phase 3 that support the indication. So as attention is paid to the sameness of product between the dossier submitted to NPRA and what has been approved by the reference agencies, so the question arises as how best to determine the risk of identified differences to the patient, because we need to balance the different with the risk, especially to identify the implication of the differences and what are supporting the document required if there are differences. So while we leverage on the many parts of the dossier regarding the quality, in order to balance the difference with the risk, so the only difference that do not affect the product quality and do not warrant additional evaluation can be considered. For example, having a list of manufacturer which is lesser than what has been approved by the reference agencies, different secondary packaging or different batch releases, and also the addition of local repackers. However, as I mentioned before, differences in stability, storage condition, whereby stability study should comply with the ASEAN Stability Guidelines Zone 4B. So this is allowed, and based on the differences, there are supporting data need to be submitted as listed on the slide. Next, for benefit risk assessment, we'll look into the applicability of the reference agency assessment in the Malaysian context, particularly on the indication, target population, epidemiology, clinical relevance of an endpoint. And at the same time, we also compared, in the case whereby the product has been approved in several reference agencies, we also do a comparison of indication approved by those agencies. So in the case, if there are differences between the reference agency's approval in terms of indication, we will recommend the indication and posology to be the most stringent among those approved by the agencies after looking into the clinical assessment report of the relevant reference agencies. So last, we will focus on the country-specific information, especially on the administrative data on package insert and label, and also into the risk minimization measures specifically to be implemented in Malaysia. So now I will come to the end of my presentation. Just to sum up, in summary, what will be a practical approach in reliance from the NPRA perspective? First, we need to verify the sameness of the product between the dossier submitted to NPRA and what has been approved by the reference agencies by referring to the dossier checklist filled by the applicant. And we need to cross-check with the dossier and the assessment report and post-approval changes of the reference agencies when necessary. So, as how best to determine the risk of identified differences, NPRA assessors are practicing risk-based assessment. We focus on the differences and what are locally critical. So, in order to balance the difference with the risk, only differences that do not affect the product quality and do not warrant additional evaluation can be considered. And other than that, we conduct a thorough assessment, especially on the indication posology, whether it is applicable in the Malaysian context. We look into target population, epidemiology, clinical relevance of endpoint. And lastly, of course, every country will have their own country-specific requirement, especially on labeling and PI. So we focus the assessment on that to ensure that the product fulfill our Malaysian specific requirement, and also look into the risk management plan or risk minimization measures that is specifically to be implemented in Malaysia. So before we make our final decision for the products. So overall, having a clear and transparent guideline is key for the implementation of reliance and risk-based assessment. And from our experience, having a dossier checklist may also help in facilitating the verification on the sameness between what's submitted to us and what has been approved by the reference agencies. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Aisha. It's been a very, very interesting and fascinating presentation that I'm sure not only our colleagues, regulators from other parts of the world are enjoying, but I'm sure many other people, and there will be questions. It's very interesting what you are doing, and maybe later ask you for how long have you been applying this methodology and see if you have results that you have followed. But I think we need to go ahead, and we're going to have more time later in the session. So I'm sure all the participants are enjoying the practical nature of all the recommendations and actions that are being taken. But we have heard from a global initiative and from a regulator. And now it would be very interesting to hear from the point of view of a pharmaceutical company, to hear their experience. So to continue with this deep dive, it is my pleasure to introduce our final presenter for this session is Dr. Céline Bourguignon, Head Greater China and Intercontinental and Emerging Markets Regulatory Policy and Intelligence. She comes from GSK and is speaking on behalf of IFMA, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers. As one can imagine, being able to explain product sameness and any differences between products that are submitted for a regulatory assessment, it's a key issue, not only for the agency, but also for a company which wishes to be transparent about sameness as possible. As the concept of sameness have been evolving, so has the industry's approaches to describing it. So I welcome Dr. Celine to share her experiences.
Thank you, Mario and Larry for the great introduction. I'm not so sure why my camera is not working. It just happened, of course, just before I took on. So just gonna try to remove the background and see if that solution the problem. Let me just try that. Okay, it doesn't. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I'm gonna have to talk without camera. Sorry for the inconvenience. So really glad to be here, and I think it was really great to hear from the previous presenters. Really great topic, and what I'm gonna say is probably gonna be a great complement to what has been said so far. So indeed, product sameness is critical in the context of reliance. Currently, that's the picture on what regulatory reliance pathway is looking at, right? Mostly based on reliance. But to go fast, why are we looking to use reliance? Very quickly. Applying reliance enables quicker and more equitable access to drugs and vaccines around the globe. Reliance is a great way to, bring efficiency in the regulatory process and really focus on what needs to be, what is different, right? Knowing that the relying authority remains independent, of course, and responsible for the assessment. And briefly, verification average review. I'm gonna not go further than Dr. Aisha on that. I think we've seen examples of good practices in what she mentioned. Verification of sameness, right? What does it embed? Same qualitative, and it's the definition of sameness as per WHO guideline. What relevant aspects are considered? Qualitative, quantitative composition, of course, strength, pharmaceutical form, intended use, manufacturing process, suppliers of active ingredients, and quality of all exception. It's interesting that site is not being mentioned in this, although it is in the collaborative review procedure, as highlighted rightly by Charlie Preston. Now, there is a need to deep dive a little bit into that. NRA need to verify the sameness to be able to practice reliance. That's very clear. Now, sameness of product doesn't necessarily mean identical dossier or documentation, and I'll come back to that. So company provide dossier that are adjusted with local requirements, global harmonization of dossier, and there might be differences in documentation, but the difference in documentation might not be reflective of products and are often not reflective in differences in product quality or in products. So I think it's essential to be able to differentiate. So when talking about product sameness, while it's essential in the context of reliance, there seems to be an expectation that it's strictly identical, but sameness needs to be further discussed because there are two key topics that deserve maybe a bit of a deep dive. One is linking sameness of product to dossier content, right? What I would call dossier sameness, and linking sameness of products to manufacturing supply chain. So if we're doing a deep dive on those, dossier sameness, right? Sameness of product doesn't mean identical dossier or documentation. So we're providing dossier that comply with each jurisdiction with specific requirements, which means that we have differences in dossier. And global harmonization of the dossier structure is still work in progress, and we believe the differences in documentation should not preclude from a reasonable use of reliance. But we need to be transparent on those differences and what exactly they mean. There might also be differences in the level of details provided between a stringent regulatory authority and the NRA dossier, but the same quality attributes would apply. If I take two illustrative examples, new applications, dossiers submitted to relying authorities will be embedding variations that are submitted after the initial SRA approval, and they may even differ from the original assessment report that has been agreed by the reference authority. Those differences should be flagged and should be, we should be transparent on and provide justification on why they've been happening. On post-approval changes, there is globally a misalignment on classification and timelines for variations. So the problem is many more changes need prior approval in low and middle income countries, and also with slower approval. What it means long term is that if those variations changes are not approved timely and you depleted your stock or your supply for those countries, then you're in the situation where there is supply disruption and there is a risk of supply disruption. So that's one critical element. If I'm going to the second topic for discussion, linking sameness of products to manufacturing supply chain. Sameness of product doesn't necessarily mean identical manufacturing sites or supplier. Generally, as a multinational company, there is more than one manufacturing site that's being used to ensure there is an uninterrupted supply of medicinal product. Our multiple sites are operating under the same quality standard and procedures and practices. There might be minor manufacturing adjustments, but they should be documented and they shouldn't be impacting product quality or sameness. And for the drug products, the emphasis is on the manufacturing, controlling your manufacturing process, not on the site. How can we verify the sameness of products, right? There is a variety of pathway, and relying NRA do not often have a single precedent format that could be used, right? And as an industry, we need to be transparent about product sameness, what is identical and what are the differences that we're having in dossier and why they're justifiable. So this leads to redundant and duplicative information being requested in multiple formats, but also, we believe it may be very difficult to read those differences and to understand those differences when you're a reviewer sitting in a regulatory agency. So we're as an IFPMA group, we've come up with some suggestions on how can product sameness be verified, right? Because often we're in the situation where obviously if you cannot verify product sameness, then it cannot be demonstrated. Generally, you cannot use reliance. There could be situations where you have an exact identical dossier and the sameness of product doesn't need much work because everything is the same. But again, that's a marginal situation. It's not the routine situation. What happens generally is that while going through the verification of sameness, you have differences. But reliance can still be applied using a risk-based approach. So it's not a simple yes or no answer. It's just allowing you to flag areas of the dossier where you think a verification pathway cannot be applied, but there might be some additional verification or some additional review of the dossier that are needed for some area to just be able to demonstrate that the product is exactly the same. So it's not an all or nothing, right? When you have differences, we think a good practice is to flag those differences understand them, and do a targeted review on those differences. So it's not an all or nothing. You can still use Reliance, but maybe with a deeper dive on the verification. So this is why IFPMA has been working on a template for the description of differences. It's a review aid for Reliance-based procedure. That's an optional tool that applicants can use to file with NRA on Reliance procedures. It's a tool that highlights and justifies the potential differences so that NRA can easily find information needed in order to make decisions on how to apply Reliance. The benefits that we're seeing are really, it simplifies and harmonizes the documentation submitted to NRA in Reliance-based procedure, increase transparency, provide guidance on where to focus the review, thus expediting the review and increasing efficiency, but also reducing the number of redundant documents that need to be provided. Ultimately, that document can be used to build trust by an improved transparency, by improving transparency between NRAs and multinational companies. I'm just going to give a couple of examples on this template with an example. For example, this is what it will look like. You have your CDD sections. You have all the reference of the documents included in this procedure, together with the comparison to the reference NRA. And you have a justification on the differences and whether that has impact or not on the product quality. So here you can see that, for example, in this example, the finished drug product release site is different from EU and other markets because of the EU requirements to have an EU-based release site. But the control, the quality, the setting, everything is the same except the site. So it really allows the NRA to focus the review on this aspect. If I would take another example, for example, on the drug controlled drug product specification, you have additional specification because the US version contains US specific adaptations. So you might get something slightly different, but there you have visibility on why we believe there is no difference to product quality. And last but not least example, stability data, right? You might get, as a relying authority, more data on the stability than what's in the original assessment report from the reference authority, because at the time you get the dossier, then this information would be available. So I think we believe it's a great tool to be used, and it could be used to build trust and drive alignment between multinational company and NRA on providing transparency and justification on those differences. So very happy to make that available. And just with that, I think I'm going over to my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Celine. Pardon me. That was really detailed, very, very excellent presentation. Just the last bit that you mentioned about the availability of that template, is that available on the IFPMA website, or how could one access that?
Yeah, I think we're going to make it available to the IFPMA website very shortly, if it's not yet. But yes, absolutely, that's the aim. And to, I would say, distribute or raise awareness of that being existing. We've run WHO collaborative review team through that, where, I mean, there is a communication plan for those templates for NRA and other partners to make that known by our partners.
It's a great consolidation of so much work that's led up to this. Really, congratulations. That's great. So a couple of things. One of the things we want to try to do is a little bit of a true-false survey. And depending on the format that you're watching us in, you may see a link available for that survey within the context of your viewing platform. Or if you happen to see the comments section within our presentation, you can click on that. And we'll give you just a couple of minutes. Dr. Aisha has graciously coordinated this little survey. It's very easy to do, just a couple of true-false questions. And then we'll come back to Dr. Aisha to take a look at some of the responses. In the meantime, Mario, I have a question that I think would be good for both Charlie and Celine, because both of them touched on this concept of sort of using international standards and the quality standards to ensure the quality of activities across manufacturing sites. And so there were discussions about PICS and about ISO and other standards like that. And so from the standpoint of Celine, you were talking about, even though there may be multiple manufacturing sites, if they adhere to these standards, that gives a level of assurance. So maybe you can talk just for a minute about that. And Charlie, I was wondering whether or not these kinds of standards have had any kind of impact, or if you see them maybe rising the tide across manufacturers. So maybe we'll start with Celine, and then we'll go over to Charlie.
I don't know if Celine is trying to get
Okay, well, yeah, she
her
may be
camera
coming
to
back in.
work.
So Charlie, why don't you go ahead while we're waiting?
Yeah, great question, and glad that you zeroed in on that, Larry. I mean, I think for us, we've had discussions about this. It's really just, is the manufacturing site approved by the reference agency? If it is, great. If it's not, we don't understand why that would be a site that would be acceptable in this kind of situation, even if it's under a kind of global quality management system. I mean, that site would need to be approved by FDA to get an FDA approval. So why would there be any difference in terms of what we would be okay with for a low and middle income country setting? So I think that's kind of, where we would stand on that.
Mm-hmm. And Celine, I don't know if you caught the question. What we're talking about is the concept that you and Charlie both talked about with regard to quality standards, and how when quality standards are applied to different manufacturing sites, that gives a level of assurance to what's going on. So Charlie was just reflecting on how quality standards can raise questions about why one site is approved, another site isn't. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how these quality standards can, as I was saying, rise the tide and help everyone improve their quality.
Yeah, so I think I understand the legitimate concern about having products of the same quality for sure, and we would all align on that. Absolutely. Now, it could happen that if you're using FDA as a reference agency, you have 4, 5, 6 manufacturing sites across the globe that wouldn't necessarily be approved by FDA, but could be approved by EMA or could be approved by another regulatory authority and inspected and have a PICS member certificate and GMP inspection, right? So I think we need to differentiate between manufacturing sites that would not be approved, which I think is another story, and manufacturing sites that are just approved by maybe another authority, right? So Charlie, to your point, we may just not have an FDA approved site, but we might have a GMP inspection from EMA because the manufacturing site doesn't stand on our US license, but would stand on our European license. So I think it's a bit, there is a need for more flexibility on that.
Great, thanks. Mario, before I turn it over to Aisha, do you have any comments or questions?
Oh, well, it's very interesting, the discussion. I was wondering, this situation that has been observed by Charlie, is it more common with what kind of products? With maybe, and that will allow us to focus our efforts. And well, I had other comments. I love the template of Celine and the procedure, the methodology, Dr. Asia. I think they could be combined, and even regulatory agencies could ask the companies fill out this template with your submissions. So it's, I don't know, but I'm getting to another area with respect to what we were talking. Maybe we can deepen the or find more out if we talk about kinds of products. Yes, thank you.
Dr. Mario,
Tony.
if I can
Oh, please.
interrupt.
Yeah.
Basically, the dossier checklist that I mentioned in my slide, where the applicant need to fill up to state that any differences, is about the same as the template shown by Celine.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's very helpful for the assessor to go through and to verify the sameness. It's very useful.
Thank you so much.
Great.
So I'll echo that to the group that has been created that, but thank you. It's very reassuring because it's exactly done but for this purpose, right? Facilitating the review pathway and really highlighting the differences.
That's great. And just to put a dot on the I, Charlie, has there been any kind of investigation with regard to the kinds of products where there seems to be more diversity in the product lines? Is it certain kinds of generics or biologics, or who knows?
It's a great question. Actually, I think Mario and I talked about this before in prep for this, and I think we're probably mostly talking more about generic products, but the problem is because it's just not well described, and in terms of the phenomenon and why it's being done, and kind of like what's the rationale for particular markets, you just don't really know kind of you don't have your arms wrapped around the whole thing. But I think certainly generics, I think that's where you tend to see a lot of these different companies that have the global quality management systems in place, or maybe potentially a different category. But yeah, I think it's still a big unknown.
Okay, great. We just have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to turn it over to Aisha. Aisha, I see that we have, a couple of responses, a number of responses
Yeah,
to the
I saw
survey.
about 14 responses so far.
Yeah, why don't we go with that? And there's some trends I think we're seeing here. Do you just want to walk us through these real fast, and then we'll tie up in the last minute or so?
So I can see that many of them answer correctly. Is I think very simple statement, so that you can answer it very fast. But what I can see, most of you can answer correctly, except for statement number 1 and number 3. So maybe I can focus on that statement.
Sure.
For the first statement, mentioned about verification of the sameness is key in reliance to ensure the dossier submitted to the relying NRA in all important aspects is identical to the reference agency's approval. So the answer is true, because we are not going to, in reliance, we're not going to duplicate another assessment, another thorough assessment. So we make sure that we rely to the assessment or approval done by the stringent authority. So the answer is true, but we also got false answer here for some of you. So and then for number 3, risk-based assessment will only focus on country-specific requirement. So the answer is false, because as I presented just now, we also do risk-based assessment, particularly if there are differences identified. So it's supposed to be false, because we also focus on the differences other than the country-specific requirement. Other than that, I can see the responses for other 3 questions. Most of you answer it correctly. So perhaps I don't need to repeat the statement.
Well, that's great. Now, this is the first time we've done this kind of quickie survey, and we want to just thank those who have participated and jumped in and were able to find the link. So, with that, as always, I think this has been a fun and informative session. I've learned a lot. Each speaker has left us with really interesting insights and practical advice that I think we can implement today. Actually, take and use a lot of these recommendations to help align our ideas around sameness. So, in fact, let's go ahead and summarize some of the key actions that we think you could actually do right now based on our presentations. The first is that we need awareness among regulators and procurers that the tiered manufacturing is happening. We need to be aware of this, right? This is something that
Right.
I really didn't realize. And though, therefore, Reliance and needs the implementation of strong verification procedures to ensure this concept of sameness. And in addition, we need to monitor for sameness after a product is on the market. Really critical, this post-authorization component. A second idea that I think we can work on, just like NPRA has implemented its good practices, we think it would be valuable for other agencies to use this as a model.
Right.
It's working, it's great, it's detailed, and there's lots of good public information around it. And thirdly, using the IFPMA template to have a clear overview of dossier differences and to begin to align on what are normal and legitimate dossier differences in the context of Reliance is just a wonderful next step. So as this becomes more and more available and we start using these templates in more frequently, I think we'll be enhancing the conversation around sameness much, much more. So one of the goals of these seminars is to leave you with ideas that you can think about individually and how your organizations can actually consider implementing these. I hope those were helpful to you. In conclusion, remember that a recording of this session will be archived shortly on the frpath.org website, where all the other ones are archived too. And we're sure that you'll be able to use the suggestions and amazing observations from our speakers today. As a little bit of a reminder, our next webinar will be on Tuesday, June 25th of 2024, same time, Tuesday, June 25th, where we're going to take up the question, what core information is needed to make a Reliance decision? The beauty of this one is that it will be after the annual Drug Information Association, DIA conference, where will be a lot of discussion about this topic. We'll be bringing in specialists from all around the world to talk about their experiences and what is needed to actually create a Reliance decision. So remember to check out the resources at the frpath.org website, where you can find a lot of information, including information about facilitated pathways from all around the world. So once again, Mario and I would like to extend a very special thank you to our guests, Charlie Preston, to Aisha Modisani, and to Celine Bourguignon. Mario and I thank you for your interest and your participation, and all our best until we meet again. Thanks.
Thank you.